on the RCD's. And so we will save this recording on the RCD's YouTube page so people can access it later. And it's possible others like Mid-Coast Community Council or what have you may also want to post it. I'm not sure. So we are recording this. We are live streaming this on Facebook, and regarding questions and answers that you might have, or questions that you might have for us giving answers, the way that we're going to be handling that is there, well, actually, maybe you can explain how they can pose questions, and I'll talk about when to do that.
Absolutely. So we'll be using the Q&A feature on Zoom. If you haven't used that in the past, you'll notice that this is a webinar, not a meeting, as you may have attended previously. So the chat function is disabled. The Q&A function is, however, accessible at the bottom toolbar of your screen. And you can go ahead and click on that, submit a question, and our panelists will respond to as many questions as possible. Apologies, we may not get to all of them. And any questions that are answered, you'll be able to see there in the chat.
Thank you, Grace. And regarding when to post the questions, my recommendation is hold on to your questions for a little bit to see if they're first answered during the presentations. And at the end of Panorama's presentation, I'm going to go through a number of questions that we've already received during this process and answer them. So you might want to see if your question is answered, and then we'll let you know when to post them if you have any additional questions. And we'll also give you information about where and how to follow up later if you want more information. And then I'm going to switch over to presentation in a moment, but I also just want to note and thank that that this effort was funded with San Mateo County Measure K funds through Supervisor Horsley's office. So many thanks to Supervisor Horsley and San Mateo County for making this possible. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get going. Okay, how's that looking? Good? Okay, great. So yeah, so this is a presentation of the El Granada Wildfire Resiliency Scoping Project's final report. And tonight I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of this effort with the project involved. Panorama is going to go into detail about the findings and recommendations, and then we have time for discussion. Very briefly, for those who aren't familiar, what the RCD is, or the Resource Conservation District, we're a local special district that serves the western half of San Mateo County. We're a local hub for conservation, and our mandate is essentially to help people help the land. We provide non-regulatory, typically free, confidential technical assistance to help people best manage their natural resources, and we're characterized by being boots on the ground. We've been around in San Mateo County since 1939. And what we do is we work where we're invited, and we help the community respond to what are identified as the most pressing natural resource issues of concern. And because of that, these are the focal areas that have been prioritized for us in recent years. We do a lot having to do with water, both water quality and water availability, water conservation and supply, climate adaptation and mitigation, a lot of habitat restoration for threatened and endangered species, helping agriculture remain viable and resilient and part of the environmental solution. And we do a lot having to do with forest health and wildfire resiliency. And it's under that sort of umbrella that we came to this project. So about this project, the purpose of this project is to develop a site-specific understanding of wildfire risk to the community of El Granada, and to scope a suite of actions that would most effectively reduce those risks. So these project goals are to define the wildfire risks to El Granada and affected communities, including overview of fire ecology, local fire history, and the fire environment, fuels characteristics, fuel models, weather topography, and then to assess those risks to the area of concern, including the most likely scenarios, ignition probability, wildfire behavior, potential wildfire spread, and a general identification of the values at risk. And then to identify and scope an array of potential actions that would most effectively reduce those risks and build wildfire resiliency. So just to really kind of hone in and clarify what this project does and doesn't do. This project does develop recommendations for voluntary actions. This project does not obligate anyone to any recommendation. We're very focused on strategies to reduce risk moving forward. This project does not litigate the past, place any blame, take any sides, and that won't be a focus of any of our conversation tonight. We're very forward thinking on this. The project does develop site-specific understanding of higher probability, higher risk wildfires. It does not predict all possible scenarios of fire or eliminate all risk of fire, including the most extreme conditions or all random events. If this area is in a high fire hazard severity zone, that's not going to fundamentally change that condition. This project does develop recommendations to a conceptual level to help advance solutions. There's the outputs of this is not to develop detailed designs or have secured permits or to make recommendations for individual residential properties. The project does model the risk of wildfire coming to the community. It doesn't go into any detail about structure to structure ignition once a fire has hit the community. The project does develop recommendations for vegetation management and general home hardening. It does not make recommendations about how to fight or respond to fire, how to allocate county fire or CAL FIRE resources, or make recommendations about emergency evacuation or egress. It does build on the work of experts at Coastside Fire Protection District, County Fire, and CAL FIRE without diminishing or replicating that work. It builds on that work. And it does focus on reducing the risk of wildfire. It doesn't, at this point, consider other values that might be important in prioritizing or developing or choosing a project, like habitat or other environmental values, aesthetics, property values, or any individual property owner's concerns. This effort was focused on reducing the risk of wildfire. If one were to develop or advance projects coming out of this, there might be other considerations as well. The project team, the project manager was the RCD. And then there's the consultant team that included Panorama Environmental and their subconsultants, Vibrant Planet and Prometheus Fire. And then there was a group of partners that served as advisors that included Supervisor Don Horsley's office, County Parks, Coastside Fire Protection District, County Fire, CAL FIRE, the Mid-Coast Community Council, and 2 community at-large members. So that was a little bit of an overview of the effort and its intentions. For more information or updates, I want to recommend that you either take a screenshot if you know how to do this on your computer, or take a photo of this with your phone if you've got it. Our project webpage is italicized there, and this will include the final report, and it will include a link to this this webinar. Also, we are regularly giving updates at the Mid-Coast Community Council. And there's always the monthly meeting of the RCD's Board of Directors, which is a public meeting, and you're invited to come talk about anything of interest or concern to you, including this project or anything else. And that's the link for that. And then there is our general website, our social media, Facebook and Instagram, which often has information or updates. but also specifically our YouTube page, which is where we'll put this video and sometimes other videos as well. Often when we're out in the field doing work, we'll just do like a 1-minute selfie video about what we're doing, what we're working on, and we post it there, and I encourage you to check it out. So without further ado, I'm going to stop this share, and I'm gonna pass the mic, so to speak, to Rita and turn my my video off. Thanks, Rita.
Okay, hopefully you can all see my presentation. I'm going to present the wildfire risk assessment and the suite of recommendations that were driven by that wildfire risk assessment. And thank you, Kellex, for introducing our project team. Everybody's worked very hard to try to really come together and provide a nice comprehensive set of recommendations to really reduce that risk to the community of El Granada. Within my presentation, I'm going to touch on the wildfire risk assessment objectives. They're similar to the objectives to the overall project, but these are really focused on what were we trying to get out of this assessment process. And then I'll give an overview of the wildfire risk assessment process. I'm going to identify areas of high risk and some key findings. We definitely come up with some interesting findings that we didn't know at the beginning of this whole process. So we're excited to share those with everybody tonight. And then we'll dive into the recommended actions to reduce risk. And then I'll turn it back over to Kellex to get us into the question and answer period. So what were the objectives of the wildfire risk assessment? The wildfire risk assessment really looked at identifying and quantifying risks posed by wildfire to the community of El Granada, and then also to develop a set of recommended actions to reduce that risk. So we're identifying where a risk is, and then we're targeting our actions to try to reduce that risk in an effective way. And as I said previously, this wildfire risk is really focused on identifying risk to El Granada. So we're not really looking at risk to areas up coast or down coast. We're really focused on what's going on and how fire might affect the El Granada area specifically. In order to make sure that we're using similar terminology when we talk about this wildfire risk assessment, it's important for us to define a few of these terms. The first is hazard. So what is wildfire hazard? Wildfire hazard, in the way that we talk about it, is the probability of fire occurring and the expected intensity of that fire. So will a fire ignite? And how big and how large, how hot is that fire expected to burn if it were to ignite? The intensity of a fire can be affected by a few variables. And the ones that we really focus on with our wildfire risk assessment are vegetation, weather, and topography. So when we talk about hazard, we're not necessarily talking about where a fire can burn next to homes. That's actually wildfire risk. So risk is an appraisal of the interaction of hazard, exposure, and the effect of fire on an asset like a structure. There are additional assets as well that we're going to get into in just a little bit. But the important thing is, where is wildfire risk? Wildfire risk occurs where hazard meets homes or where hazard meets assets. And then how exposed is an asset when that wildfire approaches? And then once we identify that wildfire risk, we can start to identify strategies for reducing that risk. On this slide, we're looking at a few sort of semicircles that radiate out from the El Granada area. I'm going to start small on this screen, and hopefully you can see here the screen, my mouse moving. The El Granada area here is bounded by what we're calling a community buffer. This is the kind of tightly dashed line that follows closely around the majority of structures within the El Granada community. We do know that there are a few sprinkled out further, but this is where the majority of the structures occur. And this is where we're calling our community buffer, within this tightly dashed area. Outside of that, we've got our treatment focus area. This is the more spaced out dashed area. The treatment focus area does include the community buffer area, so it radiates from the very center of El Granada out to the boundary of the treatment focus area. And this is generally the location of recommended actions. So our treatments to reduce risk are really focused around the community. And then the study area is this largest boundary here. This boundary is really just to be able to define our data set. We needed to find a stopping place. So the study area is about as far as we collected data and we modeled within this study area. So here I have an overview of the wildfire risk assessment steps. I've boiled it down to 4 steps, although it is a bit more complicated in reality. And I'm going to talk about each of these steps in just a little bit. But overall, I'm just going to go through a quick summary of what they are. Step 1 was to identify the hazard characterization. So where is hazard? And where does that occur across the landscape? How intense is that fire to burn if it were to ignite? Step 2 is identifying high value resources and assets, and then characterizing how those assets would respond to fire. And these are things we'll talk about in a little bit, but they're structures, infrastructure, emergency response services. And we'll talk about those, as I said, in just a little bit. Steps 3 and 4 were kind of a combination process. And in this combination of steps 3 and 4, we identified the risk to the community, as well as identifying effective treatments to reduce that risk. So the risk piece looked at the exposure analysis. Where does hazard have the potential to occur near those things we care about that we're calling HVRA, high value resources and assets? And then the effects analysis is how effectively can we implement recommended vegetation treatments to reduce that fire, reduce that risk near those HVRAs. During the wildfire risk assessment, we did have some data refinements that I'm going to walk through in just a second. And I want to say these data refinements really came from the partners that we worked with through this wildfire risk assessment, as well as some of that information that we gathered early on in the process with the community during that community listening session in January. So I want to take this second to say thank you for all of your input during that meeting. I feel like it really led us down a nice path to be able to have a good understanding of what community concerns are regarding wildfire in the area. So we're going to talk about some of those data refinements, starting with the vegetation classifications. The vegetation classifications started with some really nice data that the county had. County had fine scale vegetation mapping. And so that means that across the landscape, we had the vegetation broken down into these teeny tiny little segments that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. So for each of these small polygons, we had a nice amount of information about the vegetation classifications within each of these areas. So how tall is the vegetation? How dense is the vegetation? What type of vegetation do we have here? But one thing we noticed when we got this data set is that Quarry Park, as you can see here, is one huge polygon. And we had some field verification site visits, and we noticed that there is variation across Quarry Park. So we further segmented Quarry Park using data from that field verification, as well as information that was provided to us from the partners and the community, and field verified that as well. So here's our vegetation classification map that went into our modeling process. And you can see here, Quarry Park has now been broken down a little bit more. We actually segmented this into several polygons, and within those polygons, we've also identified some variation across the eucalyptus that occurs in Quarry Park. In Quarry Park, we know that there is a dense stand of eucalyptus there. Much of it has been untreated, but there are areas that have been treated. And so the vegetation classifications were updated to reflect these treatments. Generally, when you look at this map on the right-hand side of the screen, areas of this bright pink are areas of very high load. They're not all eucalyptus. Out here, this isn't eucalyptus, but in Quarry Park, this is predominantly eucalyptus, and the pink indicates that it's a very high load, meaning a lot of vegetation there, a lot of flammable vegetation. The blue areas indicate treated areas of eucalyptus here. And this indicates that there's a moderate fuel load there. So in areas where treatments have been recently implemented, we've dropped the load, the fuel load there down to a moderate load, and everywhere else across the park is kept as a very high load. The next piece of data that we were able to really dig into and share with our partner groups and have conversations about was the weather. So we defined a couple weather scenarios based on relative humidity, wind speed, and direction, as well as fuel moistures. We came up with a peak fire condition, which is really the most likely scenario for when fire may occur within the community. And then we also came up with a Diablo wind condition. Diablo winds are more of that extreme fire weather scenario. So where peak fire the peak fire conditions occur with enough frequency that you might get an ignition during that time, and we consider that a most likely scenario. Diablo winds happen less frequently, but they are a higher intensity fire when they do burn. So we would expect to see more extreme weather conditions, more extreme fire, but less frequent, so there's less of a chance of an ignition occurring there. With each of these peak fire and Diablo wind conditions, we actually modeled both of these to come up with hazard, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit when I get to the discussion of the hazard modeling. The last piece, oh, I think I skipped over. Oh, okay, good. Okay, we are going to jump into the hazard characterization. So here we are going to talk about how we identified hazard across the landscape. We identified hazard across the landscape by computer modeling the random ignitions within each of these peak fire and Diablo wind scenario conditions. So we modeled 7,500 ignitions for each of those conditions, each peak fire and Diablo wind conditions. And then we allowed those simulated ignitions to turn into fires and then allow those simulated fires to burn across the landscape and identify areas of higher and lower burn probabilities, as well as high and low fire intensity. So we were able to get an idea of the hazard across the landscape. And this hazard characterization, like I was saying, takes into consideration that vegetation data set as well as the weather data set that we were able to modify to reflect the realistic conditions. And then it also takes into consideration the topography. There we go. All right, the next step was the HVRA characterization. So this question to the question to this step is, what do we want to protect? So what is it that we're actually concerned about within the community? So here we've identified high value resources and assets, the HVRA, within our study area. And then we defined how these HVRA would respond to fire. So high value resources and assets, as I said, they're structures like homes, other structures. They're also critical infrastructure like cellular towers, radio antennas, emergency response services. And when you look at this list of high value resources and assets and you ask yourself, how would these things respond to fire? Generally, these things are going to respond pretty poorly to fire, which means we want to protect them. In other situations where you might have an HVRA like a watershed, it might not respond the same way that a structure would, so you wouldn't have as much of an intent to protect it as much as structures. So for this analysis, I really want to point out that we were intent on protecting all of these high value resources and assets. The next step in the combination step of the risk analysis and treatment effectiveness is discussed on this slide. And really the questions that drive this phase of the analysis are where does wildfire hazard affect HVRAs? So where does that hazard meet that thing we're trying to protect? And where can vegetation treatments be completed to effectively reduce the wildfire risk? And so through this step, we identified risk across each segment of the landscape. If you recall that slide from a few slides back that has all those tiny little polygons, each of those polygons is assigned a treatment, and then through that treatment, we can identify how effective that treatment will be in reducing wildfire risk. So we did just that. We identified likely treatments that could be implemented across the landscape based on the topography and the vegetation conditions that we know to be occurring within each of those polygons. And then the process of the modeling identified the result quantification. The process of modeling quantified those results in an amount of risk as well as an amount of treatment effectiveness. So where we have risk, we can also identify a reduction in risk by implementing those treatments. The treatment effectiveness is shown on this slide here. So we have the darker areas showing up as highly effective treatments. So across the landscape, we're seeing highly effective vegetation management treatments being implemented across all of this gray area. So a treatment was applied everywhere across the gray area. The areas with the darkest gray are showing up with the highest treatment effectiveness, meaning this is where we can really reduce risk. The areas of lower, of like a lighter gray are areas where treatment effectiveness is predicted to be lower. It doesn't mean that there isn't any effect of treating those areas, but it's not as effective as, say, these darker gray areas. And we actually have a couple key findings that we're going to get into right now. The first finding is that the most significant wildfire risk originates within the Deer Creek drainage. And so I've identified that here on our treatment effectiveness map with this red oval here. And we took a look at this and we kind of asked ourselves, why is this area showing up as the area of most significant wildfire risk? We know that this area occurs close to homes. We know there are homes all throughout these areas through El Granada Boulevard and along the boundary here. But what we also find is that this drainage is actually positioned in a way to funnel winds straight up into El Granada. So we have dense vegetation that's often found inside of drainages, lining up with those Diablo winds particularly coming into the community. And if you think about like how you would have water getting forced into a pipeline, that's the same way we can think about the wind. As it comes down the hillside and comes into this drainage, it's getting forced into a more narrow area and getting pushed toward the community. So this area, when you have a wildfire getting into here and winds that blow right up through the drainage, we really see a lot of wildfire risk in this area. So it's when we looked back into it, it isn't actually that surprising that we would find that effective treatments, the most effective treatments would be completed along this area here within the drainage and adjacent to it. The second finding that I want to share with you is that wildfire hazard within the center of Quarry Park is actually lower compared to the other areas. The hazard was lower, which led to a lower identification of risk. And then it also leads to a lower identification of treatment effectiveness, because with lower risk, treating that area proceeds to give us less treatment effectiveness. Again, this doesn't mean that treatment within Quarry Park in the center of Quarry Park isn't going to be effective at all. It just means that there are highly effective areas, more highly effective areas within this study area and within the treatment area landscape. So when we dug into the question of why is Quarry Park, the center of Quarry Park, not showing up as a high treatment effectiveness area, we noticed a couple things. We noticed that this area within the red oval here on the right-hand side is actually kind of a bowl. And so the bowl actually provides protection from winds and fires as they approach the community. Diablo winds are blowing this way, they're coming down the hill slope, and they're actually turning, we noticed through the wind modeling, they turn into a bit of an eddy effect, and they just end up sort of petering out right here into the base of Quarry Park. So that fire, if there's a fire in here, it doesn't actually have very far to go or anywhere to go, and the winds aren't pushing it. We also noticed that the peak fire wind conditions are also protected from that bowl. They're going to come across this from the northwest, and they're going to end up being pushed over and slowing down at the ridge. So they also don't get in there to push the fire. We also noticed that the way that the peak fire winds blow, there aren't actually any HVRAs or residences. There's not a dense stand of residences along the border here. So there isn't actually, from a risk standpoint, there isn't a lot of fire meeting HVRAs there. And then the other thing that we noticed is that this area is actually bounded by vegetation treatments that have been implemented. And so these vegetation treatments can offer some protection by breaking up the continuity of the vegetation across the park. So that's also playing a role in why this area is not showing up with high treatment effectiveness. So next, I'm going to talk about the recommended actions that we came up with to reduce the risk. And we came up with 17 recommended projects. These are conceptual projects of about 200 acres in size. The projects were generated through a computer modeling process that looked for areas that were highly effective. So when we remember that figure I just showed of the deep dark gray areas, this computer algorithm was run to find the areas of highest treatment effectiveness and try to create projects of 200 acres or so to create highly effective projects across the landscape. In some cases, additional polygons were combined in through a second algorithm that combined those into just adjacent treatment projects. So we ended up getting some projects that are larger than 200 acres. But generally we're around 200 acres for each of these projects. Because they are conceptual projects and they are algorithm driven, we know that not every inch of this landscape has been ground truth. So that's going to be a really important piece as we think about taking these project boundaries that look kind of strange into the actual implementation phase. So when we move into implementation, it's likely that some of these project boundaries are going to change based on land ownership, maybe the contractor that is contracted to complete certain vegetation treatments like ladder fuel removals or grazing. So some of these vegetation or these project boundaries may end up changing and our project landscape may look different. And as I said before, each of these projects has not been ground truthed. So as part of the project implementation process, ground verification is going to be very important for determining the actual implementation of vegetation management treatments across the landscape. One thing that we notice here, though, as we get into our third key finding, is that projects 1, 2, and 3 are significantly more effective than all of the others. And these are areas, projects 1 and 2 cover areas where we saw that deepest, darkest gray on our treatment effectiveness map. And then project number 3 occurs up here in this other drainage where you can also see this drainage can provide access and really allow a fire to pick up speed. So it's not actually that surprising that a treatment effectiveness out in this area would also be considered high. And what I said about treatments 1, 2, and 3 being significantly more effective than all others, we can see on the left-hand side of the screen here. This chart here is showing us the maximum treatment effectiveness across all projects. So the treatment that has the most the most effect on reducing wildfire risk is project 1. And you can see here by this gap, if I can find my mouse, okay. It's actually, a magnitude of 0.2 higher than project number 2. So we've identified the maximum treatment effectiveness as project 1. Project 2 comes up to about 80% of project 1. Project 3 is somewhere around 75% of project 1. And then between projects 4 and project 17, you have relatively the same amount of treatment effectiveness in there. So if I'm a land manager and I'm looking at this treatment effectiveness and I'm trying to figure out where I want to implement my projects, I might start with projects 1, 2, or 3 because those are highly effective in reducing risk. And then after that, it's kind of interchangeable between where you go next between projects 4 through 17. So that was another key finding that we identified through this wildfire risk analysis. Project implementation may result in revised project boundaries, as I said. On this screen, we're looking at, this is project number 1. So we have project 1 identified here with different vegetation treatments across the landscape. So each of these treatments has been found to be highly effective, but in actual implementation, we might find that the grazing, we might find a contractor who's going to do all of the grazing. So the grazing portion may be tackled before, say, the like large tree removal, ladder fuel removal, which is in this dark blue shading. So the actual areas of treatment may look a little bit different when they actually get implemented. And the treatments may also be modified based on ground verification or based on permitting. A variety of factors can affect the actual implementation boundaries, as well as to some extent, some of the treatments that are going to be implemented. And then avoidance areas are also likely in some areas to maybe avoid certain environmental resources. As Kellex was saying at the beginning of our meeting today, we actually haven't, that's not part of the scope, and that's a future phase. As we talk about implementation, we are going to talk about environmental resources and how do we want to factor those into project implementation. So now I'm going to pass the presentation back to Kellex to get us into our question and answer session.
Should do the videos.
All right, Kellex, I don't know if you're here. Possibly we're having difficulties, but folks, if you have any questions, you can direct those to the Q&A, which is, as I said, at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead, Joe.
Bree, before we invite folks to populate the question and answer section, Kellex is going to go over a list of questions that she already got. So we'll give her a minute here.
Perfect. Those questions, we can just hold on to them. Oh, hi.
Here she is.
Sorry, I missed you for a second there. So are we switching over to me now again? Great. Okay, so I would still hold off just a few more minutes on some of these questions because I'm going to share with you answers to a number of different questions that we did have and see if that answers some of them, and then we'll answer other ones. So let's see, the first question, and by the way, I want to just also say I'm really grateful to people for showing up tonight and spending this time with us. So let's see, one of the questions or some of the questions we've received is really about what a scoping document versus a plan. So is this a plan basically? And so the answer is no, this is a scoping document. This that means it provides the analysis and the foundation to advance, develop, design projects that are most likely to be effective. Based on particular opportunities or constraints, individual projects might look different. I think Rita touched on that a little bit about like maybe phasing things in based on treatments, or maybe project boundaries, as Rita described, are a function of the model segmenting in 200-acre projects. Maybe a project would be designed to be larger or smaller, or maybe an opportunity could move forward with a particular landowner instead of the shape of the concepts in this document. Or maybe a project would be to do all of the work that involves the same type of equipment or methods, for example. Ultimately, this is a scenario that helps guide project identification and planning and prioritization of work. Another question that's come up is, why aren't you focused on this scenario, or this is what I believe is the worst case scenario? And there are sort of three answers to that. The first is that this scoping effort is intended to reduce the likely worst case scenario based on modeling. If you're just planning for the worst case event, you can miss out on what the analysis found to be the more likely threat to the community. And the second point is that the analysis also includes the likely treatment effectiveness. So if the risk could not likely be significantly mitigated, like some worst case scenarios might be, where really what you need to do is just get out, it might not be identified as a recommendation in this report. And the third thing that I would say is that there's nothing stopping the community or the RCD or anyone else from advancing a project for a less likely worst case scenario or anything else that's not included in this document. This document does help to advance certain things that are deemed to be highly effective in reducing risk to the community, but that doesn't mean that other things can't also be advanced if somebody has the energy and the interest in doing that. Other questions that have come up are about what are the next steps. So the final report should be out probably, what do you think, Rita, will this week? I don't know.
Yeah, I think we will be providing it to you this week.
And then the moment that we have that, and by the way, the RCD has provided some comments on it, and we're part of the timeline on this. And then once we have that, as soon as we have it, we'll be sharing it. And so we'll be putting that on our website. We'll be sharing it with Mid-Coast Community Council. We'll ask folks to put it on Nextdoor, etc. So that should be within days. We have also received partial funding. We applied for a grant to begin to develop a project coming out of this. So there's partial funding, and we need to secure other funding to complete developing a project and for future work. So we'll be doing that, and anyone else might want to do that. And also for the RCD, we'll be reaching out to landowners and discussing opportunities with them about where there might be some opportunities ahead. Another question that's come up, it has to do with why the area south of El Granada Boulevard was included with the area north of El Granada Boulevard rather than being grouped with the rest of Quarry Park. And that's really a function of the fact that we are modeling in 200-acre segments. So it's an automated model that has contiguous segments as opposed to 200 acres and various pixels. And that may or may not be how actual projects are designed, but it does provide the analytical framework, and we have to start somewhere. To me, that project boundary actually kind of makes sense in many ways, because if one were to design a project to protect the community on that ridge, you would likely want to do work on both sides. So I could see that as being a feasible design for a project moving forward. Another question that, a feasible shape or boundary or approach. Another question that has come up is, why was County Parks project number 16, with which many of you are familiar from previous planning efforts, broken up in this document into projects 1 and 8? And so that was also just a function of how the model segments. The model picked up the highest priority area plus adjacent areas to be a contiguous 200-acre segment. But again, this doesn't limit how projects could be designed or implemented. Let's see, I think Rita talked about this, but just to spend a little bit more time on it, there was a question that's come up about why is the center of Quarry Park not a priority? The unbiased model just wasn't showing Quarry Park to be as much of a hazard as people might have thought, including me. This was a very big surprise for me, and definitely the assumption that I was operating under. So the model took into account the weather and moisture content and vegetation type and topography, as you know, and just simply doesn't show Quarry Park as the highest wildfire hazard to the community of El Granada, even considering a crown fire. One possibility for this that's been hypothesized is a potential sort of eddy effect with the weather because of the ridge, that fire is not coming down into the park. Now, I'm not sure. Winds might drop off as they hit the downslope side. We don't know. Ignitions within Quarry Park itself were modeled for both peak and Diablo conditions to determine the level of hazard, and the probability of a wildfire occurring from ignitions in Quarry Park were low for both of those scenarios. And then, of course, what about crown fires? So as we mentioned before, the consultants do not necessarily model for the ultimate worst case scenario, but rather they model for a likely worst case scenario that is based on observed weather events. But I want to add, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, that just because this isn't the most likely scenario or even a likely scenario, it doesn't mean we can't consider working to address it. But note that the mitigation for that might be extensive or complete tree removal and replacement with native habitat. That would also be highly flammable, and that would have to be considered in any project design. Another question that has come up multiple times is are questions about environmental mitigation. Have you planned for this? Have you planned for that? What about this? Have you quantified that? And that is something that would be done during project design. So as you start to plan and design projects, you think about habitat implications, or like the work that the RCD and county parks are doing right now didn't do work in certain areas because they were nesting birds. And so we don't want to work there until those birds fledge and then go back, these kinds of things. You would think about erosion control and water quality protection, et cetera, at a later phase. Another question that has come up is, why is structure to structure ignition not modeled? And there are models for structure to structure ignition, but that would just simply be a different project from this one. This project focused on the risk of a wildfire getting to the community, not in great detail about what would happen when a particular structure catches on fire. That would be its own involved project and would require assessing each individual structure or home for home hardening, defensible space, et cetera, and would need to be regularly updated. This is something that the community might still choose to do, but just isn't the part of the scope of this project. Another question that's come in is, if we remove eucalyptus and replace it with coastal scrub and chaparral native habitat, isn't that equally flammable? So coastal scrub and chaparral habitat is also highly flammable. And I believe it was Rich Sampson from CAL FIRE who has spoken with the community before about the fact that even if all the eucalyptus were gone and it was native habitat, that doesn't mean that the hazard designation on the CAL FIRE maps would change. It doesn't mean necessarily that that concerns about getting like homeowners assurance restored would happen. So transitioning to that vegetation type would still be a fire hazard, although it has a different fire behavior. And this would need to be considered in project design if all of the project is intended to do is reduce wildfire risk. It would still be important to maintain defensible space around homes, et cetera. And then the last question that we had was, how does this match up with CAL FIRE's high fire severity zone maps that already exist and that are being updated? So this project builds on those maps that identify hazards. It uses the LIDAR data, the county's high resolution vegetation mapping and data to bring higher resolution to those hazards. And then it uses the hazards as an interim step to inform where risk occurs. But the product of this assessment then is the identification of where treatments can be effectively implemented to reduce that risk. So the short answer is this builds on that, but is in agreement essentially with those maps. So so with that said, why don't I invite you to, if you have additional questions, go ahead and post them. And I'm going to start to ask some of our team to field some of these, and I'll try to do it myself. Oh, I also wanted, before I do that, I wanted to give a couple other notes about what's next. So I did say that we'll put the report on the website. I did say that we want to seek funding to advance projects. Another thing I wanted to mention is many of you are familiar with Sheena Sidhu, who has been our program manager for forest health and wildfire resiliency. And I want to let you know that Sheena has moved on. She's accepted a great position at Stanford at Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve. We will miss her. We look forward to partnering with her. And so during this transition, when we're hiring someone new, we may be slower to respond than usual. And you might still see her email address in some places. Some of that is going to be forwarded to Joe Issel, who's on the screen right now. You can also reach out to me. But I just wanted to let you know that we might be a little bit slower than we typically are and relying more on the website to get information out to everybody while we're going through this hiring process. So a few other questions that have come in is, what was the involvement of GGNRA? GGNRA, SFPUC, Peninsula Open Space Trust, county parks, were all consulted in the process of developing this report, and we've engaged with them throughout, and they were invited tonight and are familiar with this. Another question is whether we'll be doing work on GGNRA land. Well, I don't know yet. No one has developed a project coming out of this, and I don't know if the RCD needs to or if GGNRA will. I can tell you that GGNRA staff with whom we spoke was really excited that we were doing this project and eager to hear what some of the recommendations were coming out of it. There's a question here about where and when we can see the results in terms of damage metrics from the fires modeled. Perhaps in terms of a database or large spreadsheet, and what damage metrics were used. I'm thinking, Mike, maybe I can pass this one off to you.
Sure, I can't speak to when that data will be available, but it'll be passed along as part of the report. Some of the damage metrics we use typically are HVRAs affected by particular fires, so number of structures perhaps. So as we model those 7,500 fires in each of the weather scenarios, how many structures were affected in each of those scenarios? So that really is the driver for how we're determining how much risk there is in any particular fire.
You know, and I should have mentioned, Maureen Fleming asked, would it not help if we as members of the community could see who the participants are in this webinar? I don't know if it would help you or not. I don't know that it would help us with the recommendations per se, but in terms of whether or not we can, Bree, is that something that's possible to show who the participants are in the webinar?
Unfortunately, the webinar format prevents that, but I will tell you we have 40 participants and you've been wonderful.
Thanks. And that question, the question about the damage metrics, was from Greg Dieguez of Midcoast Community Council. Susan Lesson asks, there's no mention of home hardening in this project. What are the home hardening recommendations? Maybe that is in the report, and maybe Rita, you can add to this. I would just note that there was no need for us to essentially reinvent the wheel on this. Why don't I go ahead and hand this off to you?
Sure. Yeah. What we were presenting tonight is the data-driven recommendations that were a result of the wildfire risk assessment process. The general recommendation that we have is, as Kelly said, not anything new. It's very much in line with what has been presented by the state. So our report does include an overview of recommended defensible space and home hardening upgrades to different structures. So those are things that you can find in the report, but there are also things that are definitely available online through CAL FIRE websites, as well as local fire safe councils usually.
Yeah, definitely the report is saying that those are companion practices that while what we were looking at is reducing the risk of fire getting to the community, once it does get to the community, it certainly defensible space and home hardening, would be a recommended practice. Jane says many of the homes on Deer Creek are in designated flood zones. Has flooding been considered if vegetation is cleared from the creek? And so no, Jane, that hasn't been considered yet because no project has been designed yet. That is one of the many things that would be considered in project design. Fran Pollard asks, how soon will you start taking out these trees? So I don't know, Fran, is the short answer to that. So it's not just the RCD. There's anybody can probably advance some recommendations coming out of this report. And as I mentioned, the RCD has started securing funding to start being able to develop designs for a project. I would imagine, I mean, as you might know, there's some work that's going on at this moment that's removing some of these trees and is building on work that was done last year to remove some of these trees. And my expectation is that this will be sort of a pipeline of trying to continue funding and designing and developing and implementing this work. But we don't have a specific timeline because this isn't a plan, it's a scoping document. Karen Allenson, there we go, wait, that moved on me. Says that essentially she appreciates this thoughtful approach and wants to know how to ensure that county agencies will take action quickly. Regarding that, I can't speak for any county agencies. I know that they were very involved in this project and supportive of it. I can speak to the RCD that we're taking it very seriously, and I've already started applying for funds to be able to advance some of the solutions in this report. I think that that's the sense that I get from some of the others who are involved as well. Karen also expresses a concern that the Quarry Park border does not impact. Let me say this specifically. I'm concerned about the statement that Quarry Park border does not impact fire risk to nearby homes. And the consultant pointed to the eastern border of Quarry Park, but the danger comes from the northeast wind to the western and southern borders of Quarry Park. Rita, would this be something that you or Mike would like to answer?
I can take a first pass at it and then let Mike pop in. And I'll say, I'm not saying, if it sounded like the border of Quarry Park is not a concern, that is not at all what I was trying to convey. I think what the wildfire risk assessment is showing us is that areas of Quarry Park that abut homes are areas where high risk occurs. The center of Quarry Park does not directly abut homes, and that is the area that is protected within that bowl, where we see the winds dropping out, where we see the hazard showing up as lower. So the center of Quarry Park is where we're identifying a lower risk and a lower treatment effectiveness. The areas of Quarry Park that really are adjacent to the homes where we have a lot of exposure, that's where we see high risk.
And then Susan Casey brings up a question. Oops, it moved on me. Thank you, Rita. Oh, Mike, were you going to add to that? I see you just popped on the screen. Okay. I had answered some of this, but this is, I think this is a nuance different about how a portion of Project 8 has the same dark gray treatment effectiveness as that of Project 1. By extending the boundaries outside Quarry Park into Chaparral seems to reduce the treatment effectiveness of the western perimeter of Quarry Park when it has the same dark gray as Project 1. This has the look of reducing the priority of an important area near El Granada residents. Mike, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think this gets to the point of how we constrain project areas. And we use that 200-acre threshold to identify those areas of highest treatment efficacy and consolidate those into those project areas. And I think there is the expectation that what ultimately is designed and proposed and implemented is going to look different than what is within this report. So it's very likely that those areas would be consolidated into what becomes project area 1. But again, we were constrained on a 200-acre kind of target just to make that a digestible area for analysis purposes.
So remember, Susan, that this report, the scoping document, was an analytical basis for us to advance solutions, but it doesn't limit the way that we can develop or design projects. Karen Allenson says that she's also concerned that by segmenting Quarry Park, it minimizes and masks the high fuel load and massive role it would play in spreading fire to the community in Diablo wind scenarios. It also minimizes and diffuses the responsibility that the county has in reducing that risk. Seems unwise to break up the eucalyptus forest into segments. Mike, maybe you can come back to speak to that wasn't so much, I think, a function of the segmenting. The segmenting was more about developing the projects, but if we had not segmented Quarry Park, would that have changed that finding?
So really, the smaller the segments you have, the better in a lot of respects, because you have that more fine scale and fine tuning approach. And we've seen by doing that, there's areas within Quarry Park that do not show as high of a risk as other areas. I will say what goes into the model, excuse me, the existing vegetation, the cover, the tree height is all the same and is representative of what is within those polygons. So simply by delineating those polygons and making them more fine-tuned wouldn't affect those polygons if there was still that risk associated with them, if that makes sense.
A hypothesis, Karen, was really about the topography of that ridge. It was a surprise to me. Fran Pollard, it's a continuation of what she said before, that's important to remove trees. Laura Palmer Lohan thanks us and says this is interesting and wonders if the analysis takes into consideration the costs of the risk mitigating work in each of the areas that are 200 acres. Yeah, thanks for that question, Laura. It doesn't really, the cost estimates in the project don't include all of the mitigation that might be required, the permitting, the project design, some of these avoidance measures. There's so many things that might be additional costs. It's really the sort of per acre implementation cost for that type of work. And that is based on what local contractors are bidding or regional contractors are bidding for this kind of work. So we can expect that these projects will be more costly. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, the projects do show a relative a cost estimate for just implementation. But yeah, the question.
Yeah, but I think that it shows insight into the fact that, so Laura, I'm going to read into this a little bit, but it shows insight into the fact that there's other aspects of these projects that are going to have costs that we need to be prepared for and to fund. Steve Wiley asks, are there any recommendations for treatments on the medians? No, Steve, there's no recommendations to treat the medians. That was not identified as a priority action for reducing the risk of wildfire coming to the community. Susan Lesson, do you recommend beginning project 1 area at the edge of El Granada near Deer Creek drainage, and when? That is, that sounds like a project design kind of question, Susan. We haven't gotten to that level, certainly not the when. Keith Mangold, Keith, I was waiting for this question from you. In a Diablo wind scenario, is there any reason to believe the risk is less than the Oakland Hills in 1991? Mike, can I pass that to you?
Yeah. I don't know how to exactly answer that because it's, I think, a little bit of an apples to orange comparison. I think that there are a lot of similarities in the topography and vegetation, but what we know is, small changes in wind direction, wind speed can have a large effect on the downstream resources or the HVRA. So I'm hesitant to say that it's less or more or the same. It's just different. And that's kind of the honest answer right now. And we haven't, I haven't taken a really detailed analytical look at the Oakland fires from that perspective to see, all the factors involved. So yeah, it's just going to be different.
Thank you. There's a question from Fran Pollard. I saw in the paper that CAL FIRE granted $3.1 million to create fuel breaks, but $2.7 million goes to La Honda and only $326,000 to El Granada. I have to tell you, Fran, this question makes me so sad because what I thought is people are going to be like, wow, you're already getting funding to advance this and the report isn't even done. My sentiment about that is different from yours. It's not like that was one grant and most of it went to La Honda. It's that the RCD has been partnering with others and just applying for all these different grants that are coming out there and trying to get resources to San Mateo County. And I'm super proud of and excited about the resources we've been able to bring in from the state, especially with our partners at CAL FIRE really advocating for that. And the fact that we were able to bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars to advance towards design. It's very difficult to get planning dollars and design dollars as opposed to implementation. And the fact that we were able to do that without even having completed this document, to me, that shows how aggressively we're seeking funding, as opposed to like the La Honda fuel break project that had already been designed and was basically shovel ready to go, and had already gone through a regional prioritization process and was identified as a priority ahead of time. And incidentally, all of that money doesn't go to La Honda. There were a couple of other projects. It's a block grant that helps.
It was the 300 and something thousand dollars. I think there was a misunderstanding with that article. That's a block grant to advance a number of different projects throughout the county, of which one of them will be El Granada, hence the partial funding for doing that.
Len Erickson asks, will the RCD take on responsibility for assigning actual project priorities? Definitely not. And there's a number of reasons for that, Len. One is that we don't assign anything to anybody. We provide assistance where we're invited to try to help people help the land. So no, we don't do that. But also, I think that prioritization here can be a bit of a misnomer. Remember that this project was focused on fire risk. There's a lot of other considerations that might come into people managing these lands. And I also wouldn't want to constrain the world of opportunities. So what might be a priority for one landowner? I mean, we basically drew a circle around El Granada. With all the lands that GGNRA manages, will their part that's in El Granada be their priority? I can't answer that. San Mateo County Parks, of all the properties that they're managing around San Mateo County, if they're doing a process like this for all of those lands, well, how does this integrate with that? I can't answer that for them. But I can say that this really helps us refine where we might be most effective in making investments to protect the community. So what I think this really helps do is shift out of advocacy that's not empirically based and lean into developing solutions that are most likely to be effective and bringing in resources to do that. And if we were to rigidly assign some priorities that didn't consider all of these other aspects and didn't consider where there were opportunities, that sort of thing, then I think we might hamstring ourselves. So no, we're not going to do that. Let's see, we already answered that. Justin Cable, as new projects get started, are carbon neutral or carbon negative solutions going to be integrated into the plans? For example, replacing cut down trees. That depends. I think that depends on what the project priorities are. So if you're doing, are your goals about climate mitigation or climate adaptation or both? Are they about ecosystem function? Are they about water quality? Are they about aesthetics? Are they purely about wildfire risk? You know, I think it depends on what project is being advanced and why. I know in the RCD's work, we spend a lot of time really exploring and thinking through the complex trade-offs of, you know, like if you want to sequester a lot of carbon really fast, grow a eucalyptus forest. But if you want to have a catastrophic release of carbon, have a wildfire in a eucalyptus forest. So, you know, what are sustainable approaches that balance different needs? Maybe the habitat doesn't sequester as much carbon, but a risk of fire would emit more carbon. So that is the certain thing that the RCD certainly thinks about, but I can't say in any project that might be advanced that would be quantified. Let's see. Keith Mangold wants to know if the, oops, I lost it. Quarry Park shaded fuel break, if the Quarry Park shaded fuel breaks are anticipated to be effective in a Diablo wind event. Maybe that's really about the modeling and the treatment effectiveness. So I'm going to Rita pass that to you and Mike to see how you would like to answer that.
I'll let Mike take that.
Well, we didn't specify shaded fuel breaks in our analysis per se. We use more generalized sort of treatment methodologies, and I'm curious if that question is referring to the work that has already occurred in Quarry Park. So maybe I'll pass it back to you, Kelly.
So we're going to say something there.
Well, we don't have a way to verify what the exact question was. So I think, you know, talking about, yeah, my guess is were the existing shaded fuel breaks that have been constructed anticipated to be effective.
And I think more broadly, do shaded fuel breaks work in that kind of scenario? Can we expect them? Is that a recommended treatment that would work, particularly in that kind of scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to the treatments in general that we've specified, and they are general on, you know, on purpose. We didn't want to get so prescriptive in a remote sensing environment to handcuff the folks on the ground who really need to make those decisions. What we did do is specify more broad range of treatments, such as large tree removal, focusing on trees greater than 10 inches for ladder field treatment or thinning from below, or focusing on large tree removal to create gaps and reduce that continuity of fuels in the crowns and on the ground. That's kind of the level of specificity we used for this particular project. And in a general sense, fuel breaks can be very effective if done properly and if they are positioned correctly on the landscape. But again, that's a case-by-case basis, and something like that, those specific design criteria would happen later on as projects are further developed.
Yeah, and I think another way to look at it is treatment recommendations that have been put forth in this report are meant to address these combined wind scenarios of the 97th percentile winds and the Diablo winds.
So let's see, Danny Turway asks, can you confirm that all modeling was performed without intervention attempts included? Mike, can you speak to that? Did you intervene or alter anything?
No, it's so yeah, generally the process is we use models. There's no manual manipulation, but I think specifically that question might be getting at suppression efforts from fire agencies, and no, we did not incorporate any suppression efforts in our modeling, and it's kind of an industry standard to not incorporate those because we really want to understand the behavior of how fire is going to react, and it's so subjective to start incorporating mitigation efforts. There's just too many factors to consider to be able to effectively model that kind of activity.
Danny also asks if the report will list minimum travel times for fires from the periphery of the study area to the assets, like homes.
Yep, we have a MTT we have the minimum travel time MTT runs that we pass along to the RCD.
So there are some questions that are specific to individual homeowners or how they might get some assistance. I would say for those who have those kinds of questions, if you could give us a month or two while we're trying to deal with our staffing transition. Not only Sheena, but also another member of our team is on paternity leave, and we're very happy for him, but we're down a couple of bodies right now. So give us a couple of months, if you don't mind, and reach out to us, and we'd be happy to talk to you about your individual concerns. So there are some other questions kind of coming up about, wildlife and, will there be plans to protect wildlife? So, so once again, environmental considerations are a key component to project design. Period. So yes, those things would be considered. Greg Dieguez also asks about when the slides and the recording will be available on the RCD project website. I am I'm on vacation right now in New York State, can't you tell? So give me a couple of weeks, and when I'm back from vacation, I'll post this on our YouTube site.
The live stream will be immediately available on our Facebook page as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Bree. Great. Let's see. There's a question from CB Kelly. How many different projects are anticipated to treat the areas included in the scoping project? One seems unlikely, 12 or more doesn't seem practical. Any thoughts from the team? That's part of the reason that we sought funding, was to start thinking this through. Like, what are projects going to look like? What could we do first? How would we do this? Is it the sort of thing where there's a particular opportunity with a particular landowner, or is there a particular opportunity with a particular treatment, like get goats in there, or building on something that's already happening, or something that is particularly attractive to a particular funding source that we know is coming down the pikes. So design a project that's going to be competitive for grant funding. So the short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is I know the RCD is hustling on this, and I imagine others are as well. Karen Allenson says, last question from me. It doesn't need to be your last one, Karen. Did this fire modeling exercise factor in the specific eucalyptus fire research from Australia with detailed fire burn rates, spread, volatility, et cetera? Mike, you can speak to how we incorporated that kind of thinking.
Yeah, so eucalyptus is challenging in the fire modeling world. We did research, we did look at significant amounts of research from Australia. And other sources that we use to calibrate some of our information. But ultimately what we learned was we're quite constrained in how vegetation burns, not necessarily vegetation itself, but specific species of vegetation. The fire modeling is fairly agnostic to the types of vegetation. It really focuses on the volume, the quantity, the height, the density, those types of aspects of it. So we didn't alter any of our models to incorporate any of that information. It was a little bit outside the scope of this project, in that when you start tweaking the modeling, the parameters within the models, you can really go down a rabbit hole, and you have to be very careful in what we're doing. And we just didn't have that capacity for this particular project.
Okay, let's see. I don't know actually how to pronounce this, and I'm sorry if I butcher this. I'm not sure if it's Brigitte or Brigitta Bauer. Says, do the models speculate what would actually start a fire, the ignition sources kind of thing? Mike, I'm going to give that back to you again.
So no, we use what's called stochastic fire modeling. So as we mentioned before, we start as many fires as it takes to burn approximately 98% of the landscape. So we want to see a number of different fire scenarios and how those fires ultimately overlap and coalesce into the probability and the intensity. If we look at specific areas of fire starts, we're really limiting our scope to those areas and ignoring the areas outside of those areas where things can also start. So it is a little bit of a balancing act, but the stochastic approach does account for those areas where starts are more likely to occur. With that said, there's also additional opportunities to look at how, once projects are designed, how those projects might affect the fire behavior. It's sort of a test, if you will. If there's a project area that has been delineated and treatments are now identified, there can be some additional modeling done to test those treatments for efficacy. And that's kind of the best route to get at that, based on those specific points of ignition, opposed to random ignitions across the landscape.
I also want to add to that this is the sort of thing we definitely got a lot of qualitative data about with the community listening session that was on January 25th. You know, we wanted to know, when and where do you see fireworks? When and where do you see this or that? Or, you know, these are the kinds of things that were definitely considered in developing these recommendations. Let's see. Karen Maki asks, is there a way to evaluate the effectiveness of increasing home hardening versus fuel reduction? So, you know, like which one makes the community safer? I don't know, Rita or Mike, if either of you would like to take a hand at that.
I can start with a response on that. Oops, my video. Yeah, so our wildfire risk assessment was not, the focus of our wildfire risk assessment was not to identify or model how effective home hardening efforts would be. So when we talk about the risk to the community, we're really talking about the risk from outside fire entering the community. And there's a reason why we weren't able to model the effectiveness of home hardening. And that's really because it is variable, and we would be required to go around and make an assessment about how hardened a home is. And so for our current scope, that's too much speculation. And as Mike has said on other topics where speculation may play a role, it starts to decrease the confidence in the output of that model. So this assessment wasn't focused on identifying a risk reduction associated with the home hardening. And I'll let Mike talk about maybe a more theoretical approach on that.
Yeah, I think that you know, both actions have a place at the table. Absolutely. I think the best scenario is responsible thinning for fuels mitigation surrounding communities to prevent, or at least provide the greatest opportunity to prevent fire entering into that community. Once a fire is in a community, there's so many other factors at play. It gets very complex very quickly. Home hardening helps, but again, it doesn't prevent structure-to-structure transmission, but neither does fuels reduction work in the forest. I think that this is a multifaceted approach, and we're seeing it throughout communities all over California. Each of those actions has an important part to play. So while that wasn't addressed as part of this analysis because of the reasons mentioned, my utmost recommendation is that there is a community uprising to start looking at a home hardening, firewise community designation, other actions that can be taken to reduce or mitigate some of the risk once a fire does enter the community.
So I can add an RCD perspective to this. Karen, we're taking a yes and approach. Yes and that you know, if there's as Mike has told me many times, if there's really significant you know, home hardening has its limitations. You know, it's definitely something that people should do. Home hardening in defensible space should be done, and it's got limitations. So from the perspective of protecting the community from the risk of wildfire, a community that's at the wildland urban interface and is surrounded by wildlands, you know, it if it was not initially seen that home hardening and defensible space would be sufficient, it would be necessary but not sufficient. In the report, we definitely identified those as essential companion practices to this. So the next, let's see, I think that's maybe it. I think the others have largely been answered. I see a hand up. Someone has a hand up, and just so you know, we can't call on you in this format. So you would have to, oh, it looks like Len and Maureen have hands up. And so we can't call on you in this format, but you can put something in the Q&A if you would like. Greg Dieguez, what are the suite of additional study projects under consideration to answer the many unanswered questions? I don't know of any additional work that's going to be done. We don't have an additional study planned. This goal was to bring some analysis. I don't know that we're ever going to answer all of the questions. I think that you could always do more analysis, and the goal here was to identify opportunities that would help reduce the risk to the community that are empirically or analytically grounded. And so I think this will do that to help advance some high value projects. Certainly the community can do, or others can do, more studies if they wanted to. You could always do more studies. Let's see, is there any other questions? No, there's no others at this time. Let me take a look. There's I'm looking at there. Yeah, I think that's it. Oh, there was one other. Bree, would you kindly put in the chat the link to the Facebook page where Greg Dieguez had, I think it was Greg or Danny Torre, I can't remember, had asked if we could put a link to the our Facebook page where this is being live streamed, and if we could also put a link to it, thank you. And if we could also put a link to it on the project web page. And then Bree, would you also kindly put in the chat to everyone my personal email address, and people can feel free to reach out to me. I won't be getting back to you for a couple of weeks, but you can reach out to me as well while we're figuring out the staffing transition. Thank you. So I want to thank the incredible investment by all of the partners to this project, by our consultant team. I see the tremendous interest here. I see, a candidate for county supervisor, Sierra Club, local elected officials, community members, all showing up for this meeting. I think and landowner representatives, I think it really indicates the level of interest in trying to tackle this kind of thorny problem. I know that we're committed at the RCD to trying to help, but we're only one part of the equation. So Bree has put in the chat that a recording of the webinar will automatically be sent to the email that you used to sign in. I didn't know that. Thank you, Bree. Oh, Joe says that we can add his email as well. So let's go ahead and do that and put that in the chat as well, so people can reach out to Joe or me. I didn't out him, but he did just message me that we could do that. Yeah, so with that, we're going to be wrapping up this project. The report's going to be out. This webinar will be available for folks, and we can all collectively and individually try to advance solutions in the context of all of the other values we have, including environmental protection, aesthetics, property values, etc. So I'm going to say goodbye and thank you.